We have some data that we're importing, and it steps from 0 through 10 on the x-axis and 1 through 500 on the y-axis. The reason we have a 1 here is just so that we can see the data show up, but you'll likely have a 0 if you have 0 data there. We'll start by setting up our data selector. So we'll say const xSelector, which will just be an arrow function that's given the data point and returns d.x because that's how our data is set up. And then same for the y selector. We'll need to import two scales from D3 scale. So I'll import scaleBand and scaleLinear from D3 scale. We'll first set up our scale y, our y scale. So I say const y scale, which will be a scaleLinear. And we'll need to set up our range. So our range will be the height first to 0, and then we will map our domain of data to 0 and 500. This 500 is our y max value. So that means that our 0 will map to the height, which will be the lower end of the SVG, and our 500 will map to 0, which will be the top of our SVG. And then we need to set up our x scale. So we'll say const x scale equals scaleBand, and we'll need to set our range. So our range will be 0 to the width of our SVG. And then we'll need to set up our domain. Our domain needs to be passed all of the data coordinates, all the data points that we have, which is 10 of them. The reason is that scaleBand will take all of those data points and then create bands that we can render into. And those bands will be of an even width. So if we tell it that we have 10 data points, then it will create 10 areas that we can render our bar graph into. So we'll say data.map, which will just be D, which will be our data point, and then pass our x selector, our data point. And that way we have our range with our maximum width and then all of our data points. Now, to make sure that there is space in between each of our bars, we'll supply a padding. And we can do a padding inner or a padding outer, but this is a ratio between 0 and 1, and we're saying 0.3, which will say 0.3 of the bar widths will be the padding on the inner, which is in between each of the bars, and then on the outer, which is on the left and the right side. If you specified 0.5, then the spaces in between the bars and the bar widths themselves would be identical. And now we need to create our bars. So we're going to say data.map and just map over all of our data. We'll receive a D and our index. And now we need to calculate the height of each of the bars. So we'll say first our const our y value, which will be a y scale, which will scale our data point to the y-axis. So we say y selector and pass in our data point. So now with our y value, we need to measure our bar, or create our bar height. So we say const bar height, which will be the height of our SVG minus the y value. Now we'll render our bar. So we'll use the rect SVG element. We'll give our key our I so we don't get warnings. We'll set the width to our x scale dot bandwidth, which will return the width that it's calculated, including appropriate padding. Our height will be our calculated bar height. Our x will be our x scale, and we'll give it our x selector with our data point. And this will calculate from the left to the right what the specific placement of our bar should be. And then our y will be our y value. We'll also supply a stroke, which we'll just say is FF6347, a stroke width of 3. And we'll fill it with a light gray of F5, F5, F5. Now, if we look at how this renders, we can see that we're rendering seemingly from the bottom all the way to our largest value of 500 up here. But what is actually happening is this y value is this point here, 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 and here. And then we're taking that minus the height so that we know that the bar height is going to be our y value here, then subtract that, and that way we have our bar height. So this is actually moving our element here and then rendering the rest of the way down. So our y value, if we look at our y scale, 500 maps to 0. This is the 0 coordinate of the y value. So we're saying our y value at the max is here and then rendering a full bar height, and then so on and so forth. If we wanted these bars to start rendering from the top downwards, we can ignore our y value for the y position and switch it to 0. So we still use it to calculate the bar height, but now that we have y0, it's actually rendering everything here and then rendering the bar height. So this illustrates that the y value is just controlling where we start our rendering of our bar height downwards.